Okay, so I want to say good afternoon to everybody. My name is Warren Mabey. I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today for another presentation in our series of Contagion Culture lectures. Today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kathy Brock, who is a professor and a senior fellow within the School of Policy Studies. She's going to be speaking to us a little bit about action, accountability, and good governance. And I'm very excited to hear that talk. Before we invite Dr. Brock to take the stage, I just want to say a few words. First of all, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. That's where I'm situated right now at Queen's. Those of you online may be all across the country, so you may be on many different traditional territories. Please do take a moment to acknowledge those territories and to remember those people and to give thanks for the ability to study and to learn on these territories as we do every day. The Contagion Culture lecture series is something that we've been running throughout this summer. We've had a tremendous uptake from our community and from people beyond our community. Many people are interested in solutions and how we might be able to build back better from COVID-19. There have been amazing ideas shared during this lecture series, and I know that what Professor Brock is going to talk about today really gets into some of the opportunities I think that we have and some of the things that we're going to see as we start to work our way through this pandemic. Last thing I'll say before I hand over to our speaker, next week we have another speaker in this series. It's Professor Usman from the Department of Political Science at the Royal Military College, and he's going to be talking about redefining fragility and resilience of nation states, and he'll talk about Italy, the US, Ethiopia, Germany, and Cuba specifically. So do tune in for that. That will be at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, September the 8th. So with that, I'd like to hand the podium over to Kathy Brock. Kathy, please take it away.
Thank you, Warren. And can you hear me all right?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Well, welcome to everyone who is attending. I'm sorry I can't see you in person, but I hope you'll enjoy the talk and that you'll have lots of questions afterwards. I'm going to be talking about action, accountability, and good governance during COVID. And this comes out of my work with the Working Group on Governance formed in the School of Policy Studies. We looked at questions of good governance during COVID, and I know that you're going to be hearing from Andy Graham, who is one of the people who presented, but we've had a really interesting discussion on what did our government do and how did it function during COVID. The basic finding of our working group, and a finding that I would agree with entirely, is Canadians were very fortunate. On the whole, our government functioned very well. And our system, our public sector, functioned very well in supporting the government and making its decisions. However, as I began to delve deeper into what happened during governance, I found that there was one area in which I think Canadians could have expected a little more. And that was our Parliament was sidelined throughout much of the initial phases of COVID, up to the current period, and certainly till September 23rd, given that Parliament is prorogued now. And I think that had an impact on what has happened during COVID. So this talk then is going to be looking at the sidelining of Parliament during the pandemic. I believe it weakened our sense of democratic accountability and our ability to hold the government to account. And somewhat ironically, it meant that the government fell into some traps that it might have avoided otherwise. So this is intended to be a nonpartisan analysis although some of the topics are quite controversial and are still playing out as we talk. So, where I begin is, in August, we saw our Prime Minister present to the Finance Committee of the House of Commons. The Finance Committee was calling him to account for the money that had been spent on the Canadian Student Service Grant proposal and the contract that was signed with the We Charity. He defended the actions of his government, and he was quite sincere in his defense. He apologized because he realized that he was in a conflict of interest position, given that some members of his family had been funded by the We Charity in the past, and that he had very close ties to the We Charity. But he said he was trying to do the right thing. And so I begin with a comment that he made to the Finance Committee in August. And he said, "We learned that there had been tough questions asked about the Canadian Student Service Grant proposal and the We Charity during the COVID committee a few days earlier, a few days before it was actually awarded. And we both," referring to the Prime Minister himself and his Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, "felt that we needed more time before this item was presented to Cabinet, time to consider and understand the reasons behind the proposal that We Charity deliver the program." This statement was very significant because I think it really captures both the strengths and the weaknesses of Parliament. So if we look at the We contract, and that was where the government awarded a contract worth quite a sum of money, over $900 million, to the We Charity Foundation in order to operate this grant program. It had known that it was facing tough questions from the opposition when it was first being proposed and formulated. And because of that, the government, before approving the We contract at the Cabinet table, pushed it back. And the Prime Minister himself said he wanted there to be more scrutiny to make sure that he wasn't in a conflict of interest position. And this meant that the public sector sprang into action. They reviewed the contract. They came back to the Cabinet and to the Prime Minister and said, "No, we believe that We is the right organization." The contract was awarded and announced on June 23rd and 25th. The Prime Minister defended the contract by June 25th, but the contract was cancelled on July 3rd, being very controversial and receiving a lot of criticism from the opposition parties. What happened then was that the opposition parties began to question the government. They questioned the ties of the Prime Minister to We organization and some of the appearances by his family members. They also questioned the involvement of the Finance Minister with the We organization and some of the money that he had accepted, or in lieu of money, the trips that he had accepted and that We had paid for. As a result, there were calls to the Ethics Committee, to the Ethics Officer of Parliament, and also to the Integrity Officer of that governs the public sector to investigate the contract. In the House of Commons, the Finance Committee began an investigation and the Ethics Committee, and we saw that the Prime Minister did appear before the Finance Committee, although when Parliament was prorogued, he had not appeared before the Ethics Committee or responded to a call to appear before it. Parliament was prorogued August 18th until September 23rd, and some people have criticized that decision, saying that it was only to escape the scrutiny of the two committees and not to have to face the questioning from the opposition. When Parliament was prorogued, I have to admit that had I been asked to advise the government, I probably would have advised it to prorogue. The reason being that this is a government that from March, when the pandemic struck, This government was under serious pressure to produce programs, to work at a very accelerated rate in order to meet the needs of Canadians. It's a tired government. It's a government that's been under stress for a long period of time, and this is when mistakes get made. So a proroguing of Parliament means that the government has time to step back, to look at what it's doing, to look at what's working, what's not working, and to reassess things. Also, Parliament and working with the government had rolled out a lot of programs, a lot of supports for citizens. And so now the government has to sit back and say, what are we going to do in the next phases of the pandemic? And how are we going to handle some of the other challenges facing Canadians? So prorogation wasn't just to avoid the scandal, I don't believe. I believe that it was a decision that was made at a time when Parliament really, or not Parliament, sorry, the government really does need to assess its priorities, look at what it's going to do going forward, develop a budget, and move ahead. We've seen a fiscal update in July, but we have not seen a budget, and the government knows that it has to get that on the table right after the throne speech. When it comes back September 23rd, its first order of business will be the throne speech. The second order of business will be a budget of the major. Well, if we consider this scenario up to now, and if we look at what happened with we can see 4 ways in which Parliament worked and worked well. During the initial phases of the contract, the opposition was able to ask questions during the COVID special meetings in the House of Commons and hold the government to account. The Prime Minister admitted that it's because he was asked tough questions that he pulled back the contract. So it shows, secondly, that government does heed Parliament when called to account. The government does not operate unfettered or unexamined. Our executive is responsible to Parliament, and Parliament does its duty when it asks tough questions. Sometimes people get impatient when Parliament begins to criticize the government, when it gets very fractious, or when there are serious debates and controversies in Parliament. Sometimes the parties are criticized for looking negative or for dragging the government down, or in the case of the government, looking too partisan and like it's not listening necessarily. And often people don't like the debate in Parliament and the heat of the debate. But that's really important in the functioning of Parliament, because it's by asking the tough questions, it's by confronting government, it's by government pushing back against the opposition and defending its actions that it shows our government is working and working well. Once the government heeded Parliament's call to be held to account, then the public sector sprang into action and reviewed the contract and came back and made a further recommendation to government. And the government then went ahead with the contract. But when more questions arose, the parliamentary committees and officers began to investigate. So these are 4 ways that Parliament worked well. In the Canadian parliamentary system, the goal is never to impose a hard stop on government, but rather it's to question the government, to say to the government, what are you doing and why are you doing that? To give the government a chance to respond, to bring things into the light of day so that the public can judge those actions and ultimately the government. And one thing is, when we see a government changing its mind or changing course of action when it's being held to account, we often describe that as a flip-flop, but it's not. It can also be seen as democratic responsiveness. However, I would argue that had Parliament been fully operational, the wee scandal might have been avoided, maybe not, but some missteps that have been taken by government might have been avoided. So let me explain why I believe that. And first of all, let's start with a discussion of Parliament. In the Canadian political system, Parliament is sovereign. According to the Supreme Court of Canada, in its 2018 decision in the Pan-Canadian Securities Regulation case, it stated, "Parliamentary sovereignty therefore means that the legislative branch of government has supremacy over the executive and the judiciary. Both must act in accordance with statutory enactments, and neither can usurp or interfere with the legislature's law-making function." Now, all of our branches of government are subject to the Constitution and ultimately to the democratic will, because the people are who decide if the right balance is being struck between Parliament and the executive branch and the judicial branch. Parliamentary sovereignty is really important because, if you go back to our constitutional foundations, Parliament was created so that there would be a place where we could have our representatives come together, represent the views of all Canadians, and debate and ask government if it is doing what is right for the Canadian people. And that's why ultimately Parliament has to be sovereign over the executive, not to stop it, but to perform two very vital functions. The two core strengths and functions of Parliament then are that Parliament will support the executive. The government in our system can act swiftly and decisively. That means the executive, cabinet, and the prime minister can make the decisions and act swiftly when they need to. This is normally done with the support of government members, but also it can be done when opposition parties support the government in minority situations, and sometimes in majority situations when the opposition agrees with the government. Strong executive action with a supporting legislature ensures order and that government will continue to deliver programs on behalf of Canadians. Unlike the American system, where there are checks and balances and where the legislature sometimes seems determined to stop the executive and can do so by withholding approval of its budget, in the Canadian system, the assumption is that Parliament will support the executive in its ability to govern Canadians. So, for example, during COVID, the government introduced legislation that was authorizing executive spending programs, COVID emergency relief. And these were very wide, sweeping pieces of legislation. Parliament, it was adjourned at the time, it reconvened very quickly in order to allow the government to do this because it knew the government needed to act. And our system of Parliament allows the executive to act decisively. But there's a second important function, and that is Parliament holds the government accountable. So as we saw with the example from the Prime Minister speaking before the Finance Committee, Parliament provides a surveillance function. Normally this is done during question period debates through committees, as we saw, or through scrutiny of estimates. And what it means is Parliament's going to ask the government the tough questions so people can decide whether or not it's doing the right things. We saw this during COVID when opposition questions led to improvements in support for farmers, seniors, students, when it provided emergency relief for businesses, extended the rent relief for businesses, and informed the government that business needed more help than it was initially being given, particularly small businesses. So Parliament then is critical, not only to support the executive in what it's doing, but also to act as a conscience of the government. Well, so why do I say Parliament was not as strong as it could have been? If we look at Parliament and how it functioned to date, it was adjourned initially when the pandemic broke, and this was so that members of Parliament could return to their families, so that they could social distance and abide by the health regulations that were being introduced during COVID. from April 21st to May 25th by an agreement signed by the Liberal Party, proposed by the Liberal Party and agreed to by the NDP and the Bloc, and then also the members in Parliament representing the Green Party. They agreed that there would be one in-person sitting per week on Wednesdays, and that would involve approximately 30 MPs so that they could social distance, and 2 virtual sittings on Tuesdays and Thursdays of the 338 MPs, or however many of them as could attend that had the technological capabilities. But this was under the provisions of a special COVID committee on the COVID-19 pandemic. What this meant was that Parliament did not operate with its full powers. It did not have voting powers. It could not compel documents or individuals to appear. And it had very limited powers on what it could actually do and how it could hold the government to account. May 26, a second agreement was signed, but this time the Bloc did not sign on to that agreement. And the opposition and the government, so with the Bloc and the Conservatives offside, agreed to additional House meetings. And they said that now Parliament could raise more of the matters that were just related to COVID, but they also agreed to no opposition days, no private members' bills, no order paper questions, and electronic voting was not introduced, even though a committee of Parliament had said, we do have this capacity now. In contrast, the British House of Commons continued with reduced numbers of MPs, but its full powers, including voting powers. And this meant that it could be much more effective in continuing to question the government. So why is this important? Well, there were 4 weaknesses. One of the key roles of Parliament, and one of the things that was fought for centuries ago, was the ability of Parliament to approve all money that the government raises and spends. So there are 2 key principles of our system. Government cannot raise money except by parliamentary approval, and government can only spend money as authorized by Parliament. Under one of the proposals and the initial legislation that went through on COVID, the government actually proposed having unsupervised spending from the onset of COVID to December 31st, 2021. The Conservatives pushed back and got that reduced to September 30th, 2020, but it has meant that the Liberals have had spending powers throughout COVID. Now, this meant that they can deal with the concerns facing Canadians, and that I have no trouble with. We want a decisive executive. We want a government that can act, as I've said. But we also want a government that's going to face questions, and if it's not doing the right thing, that there can be a confidence vote on its actions. Under the terms of agreement, there could be no confidence vote on the WE contract, and the government could be questioned, but only to a certain degree. Secondly, it meant that we have not seen a budget. We had a fiscal update in July, but it was a partial fiscal update. It was not a full fiscal update which outlined scenarios. The government argued that it would be too difficult to prepare a full budget given the instability in the spending due to the commitments that had to be made under COVID. And that's valid. But it could have prepared a fiscal update with scenarios on what was most likely to happen to give Canadians an idea of what it meant when government was spending so much money in the ways that it was, and to give a sense of what taxation measures or revenue raising measures would be necessary in future. So this one ties into the concerns about money and the powers of Parliament and the core powers of Parliament. Sittings and the limited sittings and the fact that initially the House of Commons was only able to raise COVID-related matters, the fact that the Prime Minister then began to make announcements on the programs outside of the House, all meant that the opposition was weakened. The opposition could ask questions in the House when it was convened on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Wednesdays, but only for a very limited period of time. There was very limited media attention because they were there for the announcements by the Prime Minister that were made in front of Rideau House. Instead of watching Parliament and listening, it took away the platform and the ability of the opposition to hold the government fully accountable. It didn't have the same opportunities, and when it did give its comments, often they were delayed and they didn't get the same media exposure as a result. Also, the reduced powers of the House meant that it had trouble getting the answers it needed, and we certainly have seen that with the documents that the federal government was asked to provide on the WE contract. It provided them in a redacted form rather than in the full form, with the lawyers for Parliament deciding what should be redacted instead of the government lawyers. This means that the opposition can't get the full information it needs to ask the tough questions of government. And I'm not suggesting that anything was done that was inappropriate or, engaged in serious misdoing. We don't know that. But it just means that decisions are not being brought to the light of day sufficiently. So what's the alternative? If you're going to criticize, you should have an answer. And I think there was an alternative for how our Parliament could have functioned. I came across this accidentally when I was asked to speak to an audience on why the Emergencies Act wasn't declared. Canada has legislation that was passed in 1988, and it's been devised to deal with emergency situations. It allows the federal government to declare an emergency if one arises. It has 4 types of emergencies. One is a public welfare emergency, that it does address the question of pandemics. However, it's very difficult to declare it because it can only be declared with the consent of at least one province, and if the provincial emergency legislation is not sufficient to deal with the situation. When the Prime Minister met with the premiers back at the beginning of COVID, the premiers said, "Prime Minister, we believe that we have got the powers to deal with this, and we do not consent to you declaring an emergency." So the federal government could not declare an emergency. However, what the parties at the federal level could have done was to actually look at the Emergencies Act and say, all right, how could Parliament function in this case? And the Emergencies Act is very clear. It says the executive has to be able to act strongly and swiftly. So it locates responsibility in the executive, and it gives the executive sweeping powers. But it also says the executive is fully accountable to the supervision of Parliament, to the Constitution, and the courts. The courts are not going to be effective in the immediate term. The Constitution sets the parameters, but it's really up to Parliament to hold the government to account. And the Emergency Act said Parliament should have its full powers during a crisis, and 3 things are particularly important. If the government declared an emergency, it should review that declaration with the power to revoke. That didn't come into play here because, as I said, emergency wasn't declared. However, the next 2 are very important. It gives Parliament review of every order or regulation made by Cabinet during the emergency, with both houses, if they're in agreement, being able to jointly revoke any order or regulation made by Cabinet. So that means that the government would have to be very conscious that every decision it takes is going to be scrutinized by Parliament, and to take that little extra caution in making its decisions. And then, if both the Senate and the House of Commons agreed and it thought the government had overstepped its bounds, it could reverse the decision. So this is a really nice balance between having a strong executive, but also having parliamentary oversight and having a check on that parliamentary oversight. Finally, it provides for a post-emergency review within a year of the emergency ending. So that means government would have to file a report on all the decisions it took, all of the spending actions, and Parliament would review it and write a report that would bring what the government did to the light of day in a time when they're not acting under an emergency. They have time to deliberate, time to think about what the government did, to review it for future instances that are similar to this. So, what's my conclusion? Parliament was weakened and sidelined during the initial phases of the crisis, right up to the end of September. This means a lack of supervision of spending, unsupervised spending warrants, lack of supervision of contracts like we. And I think perhaps if Parliament oversight had been in place, as seen under the Emergencies Act, that type of parliamentary oversight, perhaps some of the missteps would not have been taken. So the public sector might have advised the government to proceed much more cautiously with we. They would have listened to Volunteer Canada when it said that there were problems with the student grant program as proposed. The announcement of the Prime Minister was made to the media, not to Parliament. And as a result, the opposition voice was muted. And I think that's problematic because it allows for our executive to go with fewer checks and for the Prime Minister to be seen in a very favorable light rather than in a more balanced position where Canadians can say, okay, this is right, this we should be paying attention to. And as a result, we have no budget, a delayed and incomplete fiscal update, and a lack of scrutiny attention to non-COVID matters initially. And we know that the two Michaels suffered because of that. Parliament became a shadow in the wings instead of being a full actor with the ability to exercise its full democratic functions. And although Canada functioned well, although our government functioned quite well on the whole, I think there are some consequences that we might be paying in the long run because of that. So my recommendations coming out of this to Parliament would be amend the House rules and procedures so that we don't get all party agreements that sideline Parliament. Instead, have a model of Parliament in place that can be pulled out when there is a crisis, because crises will occur. To the government, review and update the Emergencies Act. Is it unusable? To academics, I think we should do some serious research on how parliaments functioned, what worked well, what didn't, and how were executives held to account? What were the mechanisms to use to set the operations? And to the public, consider the short and long-term effects on our democratic system. Our government functioned well, but we do have a big bill that we're going to have to pay, and is it one that we really want to? So, thank you. Warren, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. That was terrific. For everybody online, I know that this will have spurred questions, and I'd encourage you to move your mouse around and you will be able to see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and you can post up any questions that you'd like to ask. I can see that Scott's already posted one for us, so I'm just going to read that out and then Kathy, I'll hand it back to you. Politically, it may have been difficult for the opposition to call a confidence vote, given that if the government had fallen, the Conservatives wouldn't have had their new leader in place at the time. Do you agree? Maybe you have some comments on that.
Absolutely. There would have been a couple of difficulties with that. And that is, first of all, at least and most likely with the Bloc as well. So that would have been tough. The Conservatives didn't have a leader in place. But the other thing is, and this is known by politicians and leaders, they live by it, Canadians tend to be very, very critical to anyone who triggers an election in a minority situation before the 18-month mark. Canadians say, we don't want to go back to the polls too quickly. And that goes with the whole idea about Parliament and what it's really intended to do. And that is, bringing down the government is the last resort. It's not what you want. What you want Parliament to do is to, first of all, ask the tough questions, bring things to the light of the day, have the media follow up, and if there's a public outcry and the public is watching, then the government to reconsider what it's doing. And I think that's where Parliament really provides its greatest strength, is exposing what the government's doing to the light of day so the public can see this. And then the government can consider and reconsider its actions.
That's great. While other people are thinking about their questions, you know, one of the things that occurs to me as you reviewed everything, it's just amazing to me the steps that we're taking. You know, the fact that we do have an Emergencies Act, but we just kind of made up a whole new approach, kind of on the fly to respond to the pandemic. And, you know, how much of that was panic driven, you know, the government thinking, okay, we've got to do something, we've got to jump on top of this right away. And can we put together an up-to-date Emergencies Act that would be able to respond to any number of eventualities? Because of course, the problem with emergencies is we never really know what they're going to look like.
Well, I think a lot of it was panic, and a lot of programs were rushed out. And we do see that even in some of the subsidies that went to individuals, and individuals are now saying, well, I didn't need this because I might have been laid off for a week, but I received the full grant and I know it's going to be clawed back, so I have to hold this money aside, or is it? Some people might not even realize that. So there are going to be some definite wrinkles, and this is one of the ways in which I think the other parties might have helped the government think through some of these measures, because when you have people coming at things from different ideological perspectives, they see different things. And that's why when you got some of the measures introduced into the House of Commons, the NDP and the Conservatives could offer different criticisms, but also say to the government, boy, this is what you really do need to pay attention to. And with the Emergencies Act, it's actually a really well-written piece of legislation, except to invoke it. It's almost impossible. When are the provinces going to say to the federal government, sure, you can have sweeping powers that would annul some of our legislation, and oh, we're going to consent to this? In Canada, that's not likely to happen. So I really do think they have to look at how they can create an Emergencies Act that can actually be invoked.
Okay, so I think that answers what Hannah's posted up, because she was curious about how we could update the Emergencies Act and what situations it could be used for. And it sounds to me like maybe the act itself is okay, but the trigger, you know, or the triggers that you can use to get it going is a problem. So coming up with a new way to trigger the act or to justify the act might be the way to develop. To
trigger the act, definitely. And then a couple of little housekeeping things, like it talks about the parties in the Senate. And we are now moving away from parties in the Senate, so it should be updated for small things like that. Not small things, I mean, that's an important thing, but that would be a relatively easy change.
For sure. Okay, that's great. And I think, Hannah, that covers a lot of what you were asking about. We have a question from Nadia. So Nadia's posted, I'm wondering if the government's approach during the pandemic would have been different if there wasn't a minority government. So do you have thoughts on that? And then she goes on, I'm wondering if the sidelining of Parliament is symptomatic of politics today, where we see less engagement in debate and discussion and supervision of the executive, and more of the opposition parties just pandering to whatever volatile rhetoric is going on.
No, that puts, Nadia's putting her finger on something that's very important about Parliament and the way our parties are operating. There's a comment I ran across that said, our institutions work well. The problem is with the people who hold office. And although I think the people going into public life really believe in what they're doing and want to make a difference, we do sometimes see a rigid adherence to ideology instead of cooperation and discussion across party lines on what is in the best interest of the public. So I think the sidelining of Parliament, for sure, it was in part because the executive wanted to act, it didn't want scrutiny. We've even seen this with the budget, that the government doesn't know how it's going to handle the problem with the revenue and with the monies that flowed out during COVID, and how they're going to recoup those monies without creating a crisis in itself. And so, yeah, the executive had an interest in not seeing, not being held fully accountable during this period. And also with the opposition parties, they wanted to get their houses in order, whether it was the Conservatives choosing a leader, the NDP using this period to raise more money to fund itself during an election. It's a little bit ironic, but one of the biggest defenders of Parliament and the role of Parliament in the last month has been the leader of the Bloc Québécois. And I do think that's a bit ironic, but he has said we need Parliament to be functioning fully. And if the government is not willing to listen to Parliament, then it should be brought down. But he's going to the nuclear option rather than let's hold it to account and ask the tough questions first.
Yes, he does want to go right to the ultimate solution. That's great. I think that does get into these ideas that Nadia's posted, and you know, I wonder if the Liberal Party might not regret not having all of that kind of oversight function of Parliament down the road, you know, as the costs of these programs start to add up, and as the difficulties of kind of going back to more normal operations make themselves more apparent. You know, they might wish that they had kept a little bit more of the oversight in place.
I think that's right. And, you know, even just from the simple perspective of having more eyes on the programs so that you can roll out better programs. But the other side of it as well, if it had been discussing these programs in Parliament in full debate, then the opposition also becomes responsible for them. And so the parties then stand before Canadians and can say to them genuinely in the next election, we tried to do our best. And we worked together on these programs to serve Canadians as well as we could. There are going to be a lot of costs that the Liberals absorb themselves. And certainly the WE scandal, the reason why I began with that is because it was sensational, yes, but also because it really captures how this might have been avoided had the opposition parties been able to ask questions day after day, and before the contract was actually announced to WE, they would have asked those questions in Parliament, and the government probably would have backed down, so it wouldn't have had to face what it has with the WE scandal. And it wouldn't have lost the finance minister necessarily.
That's a really, really great point. I do believe that, you know, maybe there's that missing piece to what's going on right now, the oversights, the asking questions, the pushing back on things. It's the way that a healthy government should be working. And certainly we're learning a lot about maybe the ways that we don't want our government to be working as time goes on. Notwithstanding the fact that they've done some good things, you know, to keep things moving along. And, you know, I think that it's been a fairly balanced response overall. Are there other questions from our folk online? We've got a few more minutes in our slot. We do like to finish with a few minutes before 5 o'clock, so that people can move on to the next thing. But if there are other questions that people want to post, now is your time to post them up. So I'll put that out there and see if anybody pops back. Kathy, you may have covered all the issues off for them. I think that you've given them a lot to think about and a lot of really good ideas. So maybe with that then, Kathy, any last thoughts before we wrap up? Anything you'd like to touch on that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Well, I guess one thing I'm wondering about is, what do people think? Are they happy? Are you concerned about Parliament not operating with its full powers and being sidelined and with the prorogation occurring? Or do you wish it had been more effective and more able to hold the government to account, to look at, say, some of the implications of some of the spending and the choices that were made? What do you guys think?
I think that maybe we'll get a couple things pop up in our chat as we go here. We did get a couple questions. This always happens when I say that we're coming to the end. So Ross has asked, does this, what we're talking about, speak to the problem with gotcha political accountability that exists out there? We really don't give politicians in government a lot of leeway these days. Any thoughts on that?
Ross, yeah, I agree. I find it really regrettable when we go for gotcha and we're trying to catch people out on different comments and actions from long ago, instead of looking at the quality of what they're trying to do and how it affects Canadians. And unfortunately, I think the media does play into this and sometimes presents the parties and the debates between them as juvenile, instead of seeing when they have really good points to make that are made because they're trying to represent different types of Canadians at different points. So yes, I think gotcha politics is to the regret of us all. And it also goes to a comment that Peter Milliken often makes, and that is, our parties have really, and the members of the parties have really got to talk to each other more and understand that they're all individuals trying to do the right thing for Canadians, which is in part why the programs that were rolled out served Canadians well. But we can make sure that the scrutiny is there to ensure that the decisions are the best ones.
That's a great point. Jay's answered your question a little bit. I feel that a great update in the Emergencies Act would be to not allow Parliament to be sidelined. So I don't know exactly how you'd write that into the policy, but I think it's a great sentiment. And then one last question before we finish up, or there might be two here. The question is, what recommendations would you have for the media, to build on your last comment? And then there is one last comment, which is that somebody, I'm not sure who it is, thinks that the government's response demonstrates that federalism is working right now, and the way that different governments have worked together does speak to the fact that federalism is working. But maybe back to the recommendations for media, if you have thoughts on that.
Okay, and to both things, an interesting thing is, I'll just begin with the federalism aspect first. Our governments worked well and they worked well together. And the federal government was able to do what it did. But what's interesting is when we saw the ombudsperson report coming out of BC, and when we've seen some of the comments on Ontario and Quebec, people are pushing back against the executive in every case having a little too much power, and some of the announcements being made outside of our legislatures and directly to the media, rather than in the houses where they could be held to account immediately and questioned. So I think that's interesting, and I think that shows that Canadians are aware of this and would like to see a little more accountability. To the media, I would say, when they were interviewing, whether it was the Premier of Quebec, the Premier of Ontario, or the Prime Minister of Canada, during their announcements outside of the legislatures, they were basically accepting them, and they were asking, well, what are you going to do for Canadians they weren't asking the really tough questions. And I think our media has to dig in and avoid partisanship for sure. And to really say, what is the government doing? What are the costs of this? What are the consequences? And to ask the governments to defend their actions. We didn't see that a lot. Instead, we got the media engaging into the decision to play down the crisis, which was good in part. We don't want them to escalate it. But part of that was they didn't ask the governments, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? How are you going to pay for this? What should Canadians be prepared for? One of the comments I heard recently that I thought was so critical was from someone who used to be a chief economist for one of the governments in Canada. And he said to me, you know, the thing that worries him right now is the public is not being prepared for the really restrictive measures that are going to have to be taken to pay for what we did during COVID. And we should at least be starting to think about this and how we're going to react and what it means for our lives in Canada. And the government should be preparing the ground. The media should be ensuring that the government is preparing the public to deal with some of those issues.
So I think that this is a great place for us to wrap up. Professor Brock, this was an amazing talk. There's been some very complimentary comments popping up in the Q&A and in the chat. So I think that it's resonated with the audience. I want to thank you for coming in and speaking with everybody today. I do want to thank all of our speakers and all of our participants for taking part. Please do come back next week, next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. We'll have the next speaker in our series. We did have a question about, do we archive these talks? And we do. So you can go to the School of Policy Studies website, queensu.ca/SPS, and you can find the archive of the past presentations up there. So with that, I want to thank everybody and wish you a good rest of your week. Enjoy the calm before the storm, as we say. Labor Day is coming and school is about to start again. So thanks to all and have a great week.
Thanks, Professor Mabey. Take care.
Bye now.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for coming.